In October 1787, the first of 85 pamphlets championing the Constitution were published and widely distributed. Known as the Federalist Papers, they were published anonymously at the time, although we know now that its authors were Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. Quickly, two factions began to form. On one side were the Federalists, who supported the Constitution and a powerful central government. On the other were the Anti-Federalists, who saw the Constitution as too powerful and detracted from the power of state governments. One by one, however, the states ratified the Constitution. The need for a change in government had become too dire, and most states realized that this Constitution would be the best way forward. The Constitution was officially ratified by the states over the course of 1787 to 88. And on June 21, 1788, the ninth state, New Hampshire, voted in favor, making the Constitution the new law of the land. George Washington, hero of the American Revolution, was elected in early 1789 to be the first president of the United States. John Adams, having received the second most votes, was elected his vice president. While Washington did not ally himself with either the Federalist or Anti-Federalist factions which had taken root, he did favor Federalist policies in order to strengthen the fledgling government. He wisely filled his cabinet with the brightest political minds of the age, from both Federalist and Anti-Federalist factions, including Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, Henry Knox, and Edmund Randolph. During his presidency, Washington attempted to focus on the myriad domestic issues facing the country. He pushed the Congress to pass tariffs on imported goods in an effort to raise revenue for the federal government, and worked closely with his Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, to pass a series of economic programs and laws which would create a national bank and establish a national debt for the government. He selected the permanent location for the future capital of the United States, and would bear the name Washington, District of Columbia, in honor of the first president. In times of crisis, Washington took his role as commander-in-chief literally. In 1790, in response to the Distilled Spirits Duties Act, or Whiskey Act, which taxed domestically distilled spirits, farmers in western Pennsylvania began an armed insurrection. They attacked tax collectors and clashed with federal forces, prompting Washington to summon the Pennsylvania and Virginia militias to active duty. He personally led the troops into western Pennsylvania, and with little show of force, his commissioners were able to broker the end of what became known as the Whiskey Rebellion. In foreign affairs, Washington suffered from attacks on all sides. In France, their one-time ally, King Louis XVI, had lost control of his government and his people, resulting in an increasingly violent revolution. Trouble with Barbary pirates in the Mediterranean threatened to disrupt a fragile American maritime trade. England had begun the practice of impressment, or the stealing of sailors and ships from other nations, forcing Washington to demand satisfaction. Sending his friend and political confidant, John Jay, to England, Washington hoped to achieve an amicable trade agreement and cessation of American impressment. Jay returned with a treaty in hand and represented the American government well in Washington's eyes, bringing Great Britain and the United States closer together. Conversely, the Jay Treaty angered pro-French factions in his administration and around the country. Washington was elected for a second term in 1792, again with Adams as his vice president. He continued to struggle with the new French Republic, as in 1793, they executed King Louis XVI and were engulfed in a series of revolutionary wars. Washington leaned hard into his desire for American isolation from Europe, much to the frustration of the pro-French members of his cabinet, like Thomas Jefferson. In 1793, during his second term, Washington was forced to remove himself and the government from their temporary capital in Philadelphia due to an outbreak of yellow fever. The government moved to Trenton, New Jersey, where the Continental Congress had once briefly met in 1784. Washington struggled with the growing rift within his administration. The Anti-Federalists, now the Democratic Republicans, had grown further and further apart ideologically from the Federalists. Washington feared the creation of two political parties and warned repeatedly that their existence could lead to a serious fracture within the government. The Washington administration set many precedents for the United States government and the office of the president. From pushing domestic policies to foreign intervention or lack thereof, Washington set the tone for his successors. His final act as president was to step down. While Congress had not yet placed any term restrictions on the office of the president, it was widely expected that Washington might just remain president or establish a kind of dynasty, not unlike a king. Instead, after 2 terms served, Washington stepped down and did not run for office for a 3rd term. His successor, elected by a narrow margin in 1797, was John Adams, whose foreign affairs struggles were equal or worse to Washington's. The situation in France devolved further into a period known as the Reign of Terror. Adams continued Washington's policy of isolation and further pushed the United States away from France. In response, the new revolutionary government of France began an unofficial war against the United States, or quasi-war. The fighting was kept primarily at sea and involved a number of naval battles with America's fledgling navy. At home, Adams became increasingly unpopular with the Democratic Republicans as he passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, allowing the government to arrest or silence any critics of the Adams administration's actions in regards to France. Bedeviled by members of his own party and members of the opposition, Adams took it upon himself to broker an agreement with France and end his administration in peace. In his final year in office, Adams and his wife Abigail were the first presidential family to move into the White House in the new Capitol in Washington, D.C. They lived and worked out of the building as it was put together around them. Adams ran again, hoping that his peace with France would regain favor, but lost out to Thomas Jefferson early in the electoral process. The presidency of Thomas Jefferson ushered in 25 years of Democratic-Republican control of the executive branch. Jefferson's administration rapidly worked to undo the damage they felt Washington and Adams' administrations had done. Jefferson worked to reduce the accumulated debt, cutting the budget as low as he possibly could. He reduced the Army and Navy and removed the whiskey tax which had plagued Washington's presidency. Like Washington and Adams, Jefferson had to contend with piracy in the Mediterranean. He employed an American naval squadron to soundly defeat the Barbary pirates and force them to capitulate. Unlike his predecessors, Jefferson actively worked with the new French government, now under the control of Napoleon Bonaparte. Bonaparte, looking to make quick cash and to offload some old colonial holdings, sold the Louisiana Territory to Jefferson's administration in 1803, opening an entirely new frontier for Americans. The following year, Jefferson employed the Corps of Discovery, led by Captain Meriwether Lewis and Lieutenant William Clark, to mount an expedition up the Missouri River and over the Continental Divide. Their goals were to map the new territory, to find a practical route across the western half of the continent, and to establish an American presence in the West before Europeans got the chance to claim territory. Aided by a Shoshone woman named Sacagawea who served as an interpreter, the party made contact with over 70 Indian tribes, produced 140 maps, and documented more than 200 new plant and animal species. Jefferson's second term was marred by the Napoleonic Wars raging in Europe. Both British and French navies now actively attacked American ships and sailors, resulting in violations of America's neutral shipping rights. In response, Jefferson employed an embargo on American shipping. It was wildly unpopular and even more wildly unsuccessful, damaging Jefferson's attempts to balance the budget before his second term was up. Despite the unpopularity the Democratic Republicans faced at the end of Jefferson's administration, his protege, James Madison, was elected as the 4th President of the United States. Madison, who had been instrumental during the Constitutional Convention, inherited a complicated and messy relationship with England and France, and mounting tension within the United States. Madison continued Jefferson's embargo for the first 2 years of his presidency, realizing that trade was necessary for the betterment of the United States, and at the behest of Congress, Madison reopened American shipping to France and England, asking them once again to honor America's neutrality. Naturally, the capturing of ships and impressment of sailors began again, almost immediately. A group of young congressmen, namely 2 gentlemen named Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, hounded the president for a stronger show of force. Known as War Hawks, Clay, Calhoun, and their faction demanded Madison to take a more militant stance toward Britain and France. Increased tension on the American interior added to the fire. British agents had been suspected of arming and supplying a native uprising on the frontier, and British troops still held forts which belonged to the United States. After British ships blatantly attacked American sailors immediately off of the American coast, Madison gave in to the War Hawks and asked the Congress to declare war on June 1, 1812. The American people may have been ready for war with Britain, but its army and navy were not. In 3 separate invasions of Canada, the United States was defeated and beaten back, with 2 out of 3 armies forced to surrender, although not without some success. One of the invasions had resulted in the burning of the city of York, the provincial capital in Canada. Naval battles fared much better. In one instance, the USS Constitution and the HMS Guerriere faced off in a swift naval engagement lasting less than an hour. The British were horrified to find that their cannonballs bounced harmlessly off of the Constitution's 22-inch hull. The USS Constitution would go on to wreak havoc among the British Navy throughout the war. Many native tribes had banded together under the leadership of the Shawnee chief Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa or Lalawithika, known as the Prophet. Tecumseh's confederacy of tribes sided with the British in the last desperate gamble to establish control over the continued American expansion west. The British and Tecumseh's confederacy kept the American military at bay in Canada, where Tecumseh was ultimately killed at the Battle of the Thames in 1813. Tecumseh's death fractured the Confederacy of Tribes and ultimately drew them out of the war. The British, on the other hand, turned on the offensive and attacked American positions along the Chesapeake, aiming to capture the United States capital, Washington, D.C. In August 1814, the British successfully sailed up the Patuxent River, south of Washington, and landed troops who marched toward the U.S. capital city. A disastrous defense of the city at Bladensburg left Washington, D.C. open to attack and occupation. In the White House, Madison was forced to evacuate and watch the disaster from afar.